It's a particular pleasure to have this conversation with you, Liz, because your research on China and your writing on China have informed me over the time that I've been a journalist and have had interest in China for many years.
And vice versa, let me say.
Before we get into your work, I just want to pick up on something that Greg Fisher said, which really caught my attention, which is that U.S. companies are looking for are planning for the touchdown. Chinese companies seem to be planning for the first down. But on the governmental level, on the political level, the Chinese government is kind of extraordinary at being able to sort of plan for the Super Bowl.
Right.
And as you've been looking at China and you've been looking at like what the grand plans are versus what's happening on the ground, what strikes you?
I think a couple of things. First, just let's look at the Xi period, right? That Xi Jinping is someone who came in, in 2012 as General Secretary of the Communist Party and really articulated a vision pretty clearly right up front. He started off by saying, most important thing really was to clean up the Communist Party, right? He wants a robust Communist Party at the forefront of the political system, and we've seen just this extraordinary anti-corruption campaign in which more people, more officials have been arrested every year than the year before. Typically these anti-corruption campaigns wax and wane, but he really moved that forward. Second, he talked about modernizing the Chinese economy, right? And innovation is a central part of that, and Made in China 2025 is a central part of that. And he has moved forward on that. He's given a number of speeches talking about the importance of innovation in the Chinese economy. I think, and the third thing I would just say is probably, creating a PLA, right, a People's Liberation Army that is, as he puts it, capable of fighting and winning wars. And I think those were really three of his sort of signature policy initiatives right off the bat. I think in terms of the innovation aspect and the sort of top-down nature of the government's approach, it has its advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, yeah, you can sort of undertake, 10-city experiments, right? You can devote capital, you can put in place incentives and subsidies and all sorts of things. I think if you look at the electric car market, though, you get the picture of what happens when you do that, which is, lots of failures up front, right? Initially, this has been 10 years in the making, China's electric car market. Lots of failures up front, lots of inefficiencies, lots of waste, lots of fraud. Buses and cars that are produced without seats just to meet quotas. People getting subsidies and not actually producing anything. But in the end, you get the largest car market, electric car market in the world, largest manufacturing capacity. But do you have a Tesla yet? Right? And so I think there are those trade-offs. I think they will have a Tesla equivalent. Maybe they're already there. But I think that, that top-down sort of element has its strengths, but I think it also has its weaknesses.
And we'll get to some aspects of that a little bit later, but I want to focus first on the title and theme of your most recent book. So The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. And it struck me as I was thinking about the title and the approach and whatever, so the three revolutions, there was Mao Zedong, there was Deng Xiaoping and reform and opening up, and then there's Xi. And in some ways, it almost seems like you could call it a revolution. It's certainly different in important ways than what has happened in the previous 30 years. But you could also say there's some dialectical materialism going on. There's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but it's also kind of a retrenchment. It's like taking some of the reform and opening up, taking some of the strengths China has gained through reform and opening up, but then trying to fall back to some aspects of Maoism, but we're going to be a purer party and we're going to do this better this time. We're going to be everything that Mao thought China should be, but now it's going to be me as Mao.
Right. So, yeah, I don't think Xi Jinping really likes all the references to Mao all that much. Sure I think he prefers to be seen in the Deng sort of era, but I'm not convinced he is. I look at it a little bit differently in terms of the three revolutions. In the sense, I like to look at Xi Jinping's speech back in at the 19th Party Congress, sorry, when he said, China has stood up, grown rich, become strong, and is moving towards center stage. And I think, that China stood up was the period of Mao Zedong, right? Standing up against the Japanese invaders, standing up against the Kuomintang, of course, and creating the contemporary Chinese Communist Party state. Then you have the period of Deng Xiaoping, reform and opening up, and China got rich, or certainly got a lot richer than it had been. And I think Xi Jinping sees himself and his tenure as the period of China becoming strong and moving towards center stage. And that's really that great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And in terms of what he's taking from the previous periods, I think he's taking whatever he thinks is going to work, right, to achieve that objective of reclaiming a position of centrality on the global stage. And so I think you see different elements, but to my mind, overall, the thing that distinguishes Xi is really that centralization of power. Right? Centralization of power in his own hands, centralization of power in the Communist Party, right? And pushing the party down throughout society, throughout Chinese society and the economy in ways we haven't seen probably since the Mao era. And then, putting China at the center of the global stage. So it's almost like a pyramid, right? With Xi Jinping at the top, and then the Communist Party, and then China. And then you have sort of the expansive vision of China on the global stage through the Belt and Road Initiative, reclaiming sovereignty and sort of changing norms in global governance. I think so. There's big ambition with Xi Jinping.
Right, and in sort of laying out what those ambitions are, Xi has given several different speeches. You've studied all of them closely in writing this book. And you also paid particular attention to a speech he gave earlier this month, where he said the Chinese military should be ready to go to battle. And he said, we want peaceful reunification with Taiwan, and we have an idea of when we want that to happen. And if it isn't moving in that direction, it is also possible that we'll use force. How did you read that?
So, it was interesting. Xi Jinping gave this speech on the anniversary of Deng Xiaoping's speech, where Deng said, basically, we are ceasing hostilities with Taiwan, right? So no more hostilities across the Taiwan Strait. But Deng also said we're going to have one country, two systems, right? He also, put that out there. I see Xi's speech in part as a reaction to Tsai Ing-wen, right, the president of Taiwan, and her, I think, effort to sort of diversify, right, relationships. Her, comment that, Taiwan is going to bid farewell to its over-reliance on a single market. Her new southbound policy, which is really about reaching, out to ASEAN, but also to India, et cetera. I think what we've seen, and then strengthening ties with the U.S., I think that's another, component of it. I think what we've seen, leading up to this speech really represents the past 2 years, I would say more appropriately, the past 2 years of Xi's policy toward Taiwan. It's a very hardline speech. There are coercive elements that have emerged in China's approach to Taiwan since Tsai Ing-wen was elected, cutting off sort of the quasi-official negotiations that had existed, basically persuading 5 countries to shift their recognition away from Taiwan and to the mainland China, basically trying to limit Taiwan's independence of movement. In terms of the military element of it, I think he's always said that. That's actually not new, and he said that back in 2013, that they're prepared to use force, and others have said it previously. I think the reason it comes across a little bit differently is, first in the context of all the other measures that he has been taking to bring pressure to bear on Taiwan, but also in the context of his broader moves to realize sovereignty, right? And the fact that he so directly in this speech linked the issue of Chinese sovereignty to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Mm-hmm. So, once you know that his calling card is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, that's what's out there. And now he said that the sovereignty issue is an essential element of that, right? And we need to make progress on this sooner rather than later. We can't pass this issue of reunification in Taiwan from one generation to the next, right? You begin to get the sense that, look at what he's done in the South China Sea, militarizing the 7 artificial features. Look at what's happening in Hong Kong and the, really extraordinary pressure that he's brought to bear there, sort of the closing off of political freedoms. And you have to think that he's signaling that he wants to make progress, right, on this reunification. And he called for the meetings of representative entities in Taiwan and, sort of their partners in the mainland to meet and discuss the development of a roadmap. So I think it's, is it something really new? No. Does it represent sort of pushing the boundaries, trying to take the next steps? Yeah, I think it does.
And it is at least tangentially related to Made in China 2025 and the aspirations, tied up there and beyond, because Chinese investment into China from Taiwanese companies, sharing of technology, et cetera, has been part of what has helped China build up its own technological prowess.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the striking things is that, I think it was the World Economic Forum's report just this year came out and said that they ranked Taiwan the 4th most innovative, we'll call it nation, in the world after Germany, the United States, and Switzerland, right? So, to the extent that the mainland can, induce, right, Taiwanese business people, and they're trying their hardest to do it, offering them national treatment and, saying that they can partake in government procurement, I think it's all to, China's benefit.
Yeah. So that's one potential flashpoint. You mentioned the South China Sea, that's another. But in the region writ large, China certainly, and when I say China here, I'm talking about the Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party. They're looking with the Belt and Road Initiative and also with the technological edge they'll get through Made in China 2025 to play, a clear leadership role in the region at least, and hopefully in the world. I think there's, or there has been anyway, an assumption in the halls of power in Beijing of, and those in the region will be grateful because we will all share prosperity. And for a time, I would say around 2005, 2006, I actually did a series on this, how China's rise is affecting traditional US allies in Asia. I was hearing a lot of, this is good for us all. But a lot of the neighbors have started to temper their opinions about how what China is doing is affecting them. There was a recent survey done by a Singapore government think tank of Southeast Asians. It was like 1,000 respondents from all 10 South ASEAN countries. And 70% of them said, we feel our countries need to be careful about how we accept Chinese investment in the Belt and Road Initiative because we don't think this is a win-win. How do you think this is going to affect Xi Jinping's aspirations, Xi Jinping's China dream of what China will become over these next decades?
Right. So I think Belt and Road Initiative, certainly one of the sort of flagship policies of Xi Jinping's foreign policy. And I think in its initial conception, it was about hard infrastructure. It was about it had a lot to do. There's an element where it was exporting over capacity. It was about connecting some of the lesser developed parts of China through to the rest of Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa. And then it evolved, right? And I think it evolved into having a digital Belt and Road, right? So you have the satellite systems and the fiber optic cables and e-commerce.
Yeah.
You have a polar belt, right? So to connect China through to Europe, through the Arctic. She has welcomed Latin America, into all of this as well. So basically the whole world now is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. But you're right, there's a lot of pushback, not just in Asia, but also in some African countries and in Latin America. Some countries are rewriting their investment laws, not simply the advanced industrialized economies, but others, to try to sort of protect against some of this. So I think there's concern about the way that China goes about doing its investment in terms of the transparency, in terms of environmental impacts, labor issues. So a lot of infrastructure projects that come are done overwhelmingly by Chinese construction companies. So sometimes local populations feel as though they're not getting all of the benefits of these projects. Within China, there has definitely been a rethink about the Belt and Road, to how to go about it. There are non-governmental organizations and others who are trying to push the idea that China needs to be more sensitive to the concerns of local communities. It's not enough just to go in and do a deal sort of at the highest level, that you need to account, do environmental impact assessments, do social impact assessments. There's clearly been, and we heard about this earlier, sort of concern about, that these projects are just money losing, right? And they're stupid. and Beijing's not going to win as a result. And there are a lot of economists, and I did some interviews actually when I was doing the research for the book with some of them in China who thought the whole plan was a terrible idea from the get-go. And so I think there's a lot of, because they thought that it was going to be money losing, right? And so because, you know, in many respects, the Belt and Road is a combination of things. It's not simply about the economics of it, or it has become not simply about economics, it's about security, right? Those ports that China now has taken controlling stake in become ports where PLA Navy ships can stop and pay visits, and they have, you know, right? And there's a political element to it. Right, so that digital Belt and Road, right? So you now have China talking more broadly about the ability of China to be an alternative development model, right? And saying, you know, we'll come to Tanzania and train you on how to control your media, right? How to manage dissent. You know, we will provide not only the sort of telecommunications infrastructure in Kenya, but we can also provide the content for all of you villagers. And in the process, perhaps we will take out the BBC and Al Jazeera and leave in, you know, CGTN. So there's a lot going on there.
The Chinese government-run international news agency.
And so I think there's a lot going on there. Again, I think it's opportunistic. I don't think this was a grand plan of Xi Jinping when he did this initial speech in Kazakhstan. But when he announced the Belt and Road, but I think, you know, it's opportunistic. But there are pushes and pulls and pushbacks that I think, again, are causing, you know, some tempering of enthusiasm.
And that's, of course, true in the United States as well. There is concern about ways in which the Chinese government has been active in, you know, maybe having more of an aggressive voice in certain arenas than Americans are comfortable with. There's a recent Hoover Institution report, Chinese Influence in American Interests, Promoting Constructive Vigilance. You helped write that report. Could you talk a little about, you know, why it was decided to do this report and, you know, what you feel the most important, you know, findings in it were? Sure.
So the report, which was a joint report between the Asia Society, in fact, and the Hoover Institution, and sort of organized by Orville Schell from the Asia Society and Larry Diamond, and I was one of the people who, as you said, contributed to it. I think the report came about, you know, first because there had been so much talk about things like Confucius Institutes on college campuses, but not necessarily a lot of really thorough research and thought given to, you know, what are these, you know, institutions actually doing? What's their impact? You know, do they really make a difference, right? But also because other countries like Australia, right, had really blown this issue of Chinese influence wide open. And, you know, part of it was that in Australia, you had the, you know, Chinese government, United Front efforts, you know, becoming involved in their elections and other things. And the sort of system there is much more open than ours in those ways. But I think it prompted some thinking here in the US about the need to look at this issue of Chinese influence and, you know, how serious is it really, and you know, sort of, and what do we need to do to respond? You know, I can say overall that certainly there are aspects of Chinese, you know, influence that the US needs to be concerned about. And, you know, Confucius Institutes, just to take an example, could be one. Why? Because Confucius Institutes don't operate generally within the framework of the governance of the institution in which they're hosted, right? Because they import their teachers from Beijing who are forced to meet a certain set of political considerations. I think back to taking newspaper Chinese when I was getting my PhD at the University of Michigan, and I think, okay, what if I were taking a newspaper Chinese class in a Confucius Institute, you know, center-dominated classroom? You know, would we be able to have discussions about Tiananmen Square? Right, what would we talk about? Would we be able to talk about what's happening in terms of civil society and political repression and things like that in China? I don't know. So for me, that was the kind of concern that drove me to sort of participate in this. In the end, I would say that the Chinese influence, the most important thing for the United States is, as they say, to shine a light, right, to maintain transparency. You know, I look at the Council on Foreign Relations where I work, and there's all sorts of efforts on the part of Chinese officials to influence what we do, right? So, you're going to host this Taiwanese official, well, then you can't host this mainland Chinese official. You know, complaints about hosting the Dalai Lama, whatever, all sorts of different ways to try to constrain what we do. You know, to me, you just push back, right? And say, well, we're going to do it anyway. And so part of what came out of all of this is a sense that you have to shine a light on what's going on so that you're informing all of your partners, whether you're a university or you're a think tank or you're a business or you're the U.S. government, so that shared knowledge, right, gives you strength. And second, that you think very carefully about how to respond, right? And part of that is just what we don't want to have happen, which is some kind of return to McCarthyism, right? Where we have, you know, what's that guy's name? Stephen Miller, right? In the U.S. government, saying things like we should just ban all Chinese, you know, students. I mean, that's just, you know, I can't imagine anything worse than that, right? So I think what the report really says is, you know, look carefully at the nature of the problem and develop an appropriate response. You know, don't not do anything, but don't overreact, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, I would think, I haven't had this specific conversation with a senior Chinese official, but I would think a response to this from the Chinese government might be, it's not like you guys haven't tried to, you know, interfere in your own way in various countries. It's not like other leading powers like, you know, Britain and France didn't have, like the British Council and the Alliance Française, where they also, you know, tried to have a voice within different societies. Yeah,
and we're certainly, and the report certainly doesn't say that Confucius Institute should be banned. It says move them off, right, college campuses, make them standalone entities, make clear what their mission is in a full and comprehensive sense, right? So part of the problem is just assuming, right, in the context of a university education, that isn't what's going on.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really, you know, again, it's drawing that fine distinction. And, you know, part of it, too, is reciprocity, right? So China, you know, has allowed about 3 now American centers and American, you know, corners in China. And, you know, we've got 500 different Confucius Institutes and classrooms here in the United States. So there is an element of, you know, we need to have a little more equivalence here in terms of these things.
Yeah. So the Chinese government has over time, recently, like over the last decade or so, made a point of studying, you know, how did other great powers rise? You know, what did they do? What worked for them? And, you know, again, this, you know, planning for the Super Bowl thing, you know, how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that's going to work for us? And while, you know, having complete self-consciousness about the fact that the United States it has had many of these same problems I'm about to list in different ways. It seems like the Chinese government has an issue of trust on several different levels. At the level of the population, they spend a huge amount of money on internal public security, a huge amount on censorship. You know, people, you know, when they have been allowed to speak, like on Weibo, when we could see, you know, back in 2010, 2011, 2012, before there was a clampdown, you know, the sort of criticisms people were coming up with, and it was loyal opposition. It wasn't like, you know, bring down the state, but it was like, this is this corrupt official, and this is this problem we're having. And the government wasn't comfortable with that, at least Xi Jinping wasn't. There's China's neighbors who don't entirely trust what the Chinese government intends to do and how it will affect them, and doesn't believe that this is going to be a win-win for them. And I'm wondering if you think that Xi Jinping in particular, but his circle more generally, has it in them to kind of take a note, you know, to say, okay, we need to change a little bit how we're approaching all this. Right.
So I think it's interesting, this past summer, reportedly, from many different sources in Beijing, Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji sent a note to the members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo and said, rein him in, basically, right? That there's too much overreach here, that he's gone, you know, too far, and he needs to be, you know, brought back. That there was a sense that his ambition was creating certainly international opposition, right? Again, with the Belt and Road, but also, you know, in terms of all of these new investment laws, et cetera, that are coming back. We have free and open Indo-Pacific. It has not been difficult for the Trump administration to rally countries right? Particularly on the security front. But even on the trade front, while a lot of European countries and the Japanese don't like the tariffs, they do like the United States stepping out in front and pushing back against China on what they consider to be unfair trade practices and the creation of, not a level playing field, right, for companies. So I think, a lot of people in China recognize that, Xi's ambitions have created this kind of pushback from the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world. I think internally as well, you saw, the failure to move forward on economic reform. You had a lot of reform economists within China, right? They had that meeting earlier in the fall saying, we need to make progress, right? That if we don't make progress, we're going to sink back. There's not going to be any great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation if you don't begin to live up to some of the things that you put in the 2013 economic reform agenda plan, so third plan. So I think there's a lot of opposition. I think liberal intellectuals, entrepreneurs. I think within China and outside China, there is a fair amount of what I call at least pockets of discontent with the direction in which Xi Jinping is moving the country. Is he going to take note? I would say thus far, I don't see him as someone who's been terribly self-reflective in that regard. I do think what we're seeing in terms of these sort of initial moves on economic reform that Wendy sort of ticked off at the outset of this conference reflect more of a push on Xi Jinping than his natural inclination. I think his back is up against the wall a little bit in terms of the slowing Chinese economy, and he's being pushed to do this. But I don't see him as someone who, by his nature, is going to say, hey, for example, the KMT just swept the local elections in Taiwan, which did just happen. Maybe I'll take a step back and declare some victory, not insist on the 92 consensus, and start to talk again with Taiwan. I don't see him as someone who's prone to do that unless he's pushed.
So one very last question with a 30-second answer.
Okay.
So 2 generations in China have grown up under a much more open government. There have been extraordinary changes in China during that time, strengthening economy, more Chinese being able to travel more broadly, being more aware of what's happening in the rest of the world, getting better education within China. That's all been built up. These last 5 years, there's been much more of a clampdown on what people can say, what they can learn at university, even as some of these other strengths have been built upon. And so I'm wondering whether you think on this front as well, there might be a synthesis from having the pendulum having swung from one side to the other.
Okay, 30 seconds, I would say. Way too hard to characterize Chinese society. I would say you see broad movements like the feminist movement, the environmental movement, LGBTQ movement, I think incredible. At the same time, when I did the interviews for my book, I just talked to 15 young Chinese in a kind of We Work China version and asked them about the social credit system, right? And they mostly were very positive about it. Because they said there's a lack of individual trust, among people that are not part of your family or your inner circle. This is a way for us to have individual trust, and that little bit taught me more about remembering, the importance of political culture, right, in any society, and not to assume that just because we here in the United States place a primacy on individual rights that necessarily, everybody in China does.
Yeah. Liz, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Mary Kay, thank you. That was fantastic.